When love, betrayal, and hidden truths collide, John discovers that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who know your heart, and the deadliest secrets are the ones you never knew you were keeping. The Montana sky looked like it had been carved from cold steel, the late October light muted by thick clouds pressing down over the endless sweep of prairie. I was still holding the coffee I'd bought minutes earlier when the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled my attention to the road. Stephanie's sedan was rolling forward, her eyes fixed on me from behind the windshield. For a split second, I thought she was pulling up to let me in. Instead, the window slid down, and her voice carried over the wind. "Figure out yourself," she said, lips curling into a grin I couldn't place. Half amusement, half cruelty. Then she pressed the gas. Jessica and Vanessa's laughter spilled from the open window like a taunt, high and sharp, until the car pulled away. Their silhouettes in the back seat leaned toward each other, sharing whatever joke my humiliation had sparked. I just stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, the October wind finding every gap in my jacket. I took a step forward, then stopped, staring at my other hand. My keys. Only they weren't the right keys. No truck key, no fob. Just a brass ring with my house keys. The truck was still in Denver, 200 miles and a whole mountain range away. My pulse pounded in my ears. It had to be a prank. Stephanie's always had a streak for playful surprises, though never this cruel. "This isn't funny," I called after them, but the sound was swallowed by the wind and distance. The clerk at the counter inside the gas station barely looked up when I came back in. The bell above the door jingled softly. My voice came out more strained than I intended. "Know how much a bus ticket to Denver costs?" He shook his head, pulling a crumpled newspaper toward him. "No buses from here. Closest stop's Billings, 40 miles east." 40 miles. I pictured walking it in the cold and almost laughed at the absurdity. 9 years earlier, the first time I'd met Stephanie, she'd been on the edge of a construction site wearing a white hard hat and steel-toe boots, holding a clipboard like she owned the place. I was smitten in minutes. She listened when I talked, laughed at my dry jokes, and made me feel like I'd found someone who understood me without me having to explain myself. Her sisters, that was another story. Jessica, with her quick, cutting remarks that always had a second edge. Vanessa, with her constant teasing, rolling her eyes any time I offered to help, as though I was just one more man convinced the world revolved around him. I tried to be patient. Stephanie said they were protective, that I'd grow on them. 8 years of marriage later, I hadn't. I pulled my phone from my pocket. Stephanie's number went to voicemail. Jessica's too. Vanessa had blocked me months ago after a petty argument about nothing I could remember now. I leaned against the counter, staring at the faded map of Montana pinned to the wall, red marker lines showing interstate routes. I could get to Billings if I found a ride. From there, maybe a bus to Denver. I'd have to figure it out. As I stepped back outside, the wind bit into my skin, sharp as the moment I realized this wasn't just a thoughtless joke that would be over in an hour. This was planned, premeditated, a message, and it wasn't one I could ignore. The taxi ride to Billings felt longer than it should have. The driver was a man in his 50s with deep lines around his eyes and a trucker's tan. He kept the radio low, an old country station humming out songs about heartbreak and bad decisions. I didn't tell him why I needed a ride. I just stared out the window at the dry fields and broken fence lines sliding by. When we pulled up to the Greyhound station, the place looked tired, like it had been forgotten decades ago. A few people sat slumped on the benches inside, clutching bags like they were lifelines. I bought my ticket to Denver, $1.17 one way. 14 hours in a narrow seat with the smell of diesel in my nostrils. The bus rattled to life, and the highway lights in Billings faded behind us. I tried calling Stephanie one last time. Voicemail. I stare at the screen, waiting for the red icon to flash with a new message, some kind of explanation, but it stayed dark. Hours passed. Wyoming rolled by in darkness, the mountains invisible except for their silhouettes against the stars. Somewhere outside Casper, the truth began to sink in. Not the surface truth that my wife and her sisters had pulled a cruel prank, but the deeper truth. This wasn't about teaching me independence. This was about humiliation, control, making sure I knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. I replayed the weekend in my head. The little looks Stephanie had shared with her sisters, the half-hidden smirks, the way they'd insisted we take her car instead of mine. Every detail felt sharper now, deliberate instead of random. They'd wanted me trapped. By the time the bus rolled into Denver at 8 a.m., the cold resolve in my chest was set. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want an explanation. I wanted out. The house looked exactly as we'd left it on Friday morning. No car in the driveway. No signs of life inside. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the silence pressing in. Then I went to Stephanie's laptop. It was locked, but she'd left tabs open. That's when I found them. The group chats. Scrolling through those messages was like peeling back the skin of my marriage to see what was rotting underneath. Screenshots of my text to Stephanie, annotated with laughing emojis. Photos of me asleep on the couch, captioned like I were a joke they shared between them. And then weeks of back and forth about the Montana trip. Plans to ditch me. Bets on how I'd react. Contingencies if I somehow got home first. Reading it, something inside me snapped. There's a kind of heartbreak that comes from losing someone you love. And then there's the colder, harder heartbreak of realizing they were never the person you thought they were. This was the second kind. I closed the laptop, grabbed a duffel bag, and walked out the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't leave a note. I just drove my truck to my brother Kevin's place in Colorado Springs. Kevin didn't ask questions. He just moved a pile of laundry off the spare bed and handed me a beer. We sat in the small living room, the TV flickering in the corner, while I told him everything. When I finished, he shook his head. "You're better off without her, John." That night, lying in Kevin's guest room, I kept hearing the laughter from the car as it pulled away from the gas station. But beneath that, I started hearing something else, a voice in the back of my mind that said this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain had been relentless for 3 days, turning the narrow streets into shallow rivers and making the city feel like a half-forgotten dream. John sat by his apartment window, watching rivulets race each other down the glass. He could almost hear Rachel's voice in the rhythm of the drops, the cadence of her laughter when the two of them had once gotten caught in a sudden storm and taken shelter under a tiny shop awning. That memory wasn't comforting anymore. It was a knife with a handle made of hope and a blade made of betrayal. Ever since he had seen the files on Victor's desk, John couldn't stop replaying the chain of events that had led to that moment. Victor wasn't just taking over projects. He was dismantling John's reputation piece by piece. And Rachel, who had once sworn she believed in him more than anyone else, was now acting like his downfall was inevitable. He wasn't sure which betrayal cut deeper, the professional or the personal. The phone rang, slicing through the gloom. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. Against his better judgment, John answered. A voice on the other end was low, urgent, almost whispering. "You don't know me, but I know what's happening to you," the caller said. "If you want to save what's left of your life, meet me at the corner of 7th and Elm in 30 minutes. Come alone." The line went dead before John could ask a single question. His mind raced. It could be a trap, or it could be the break he'd been desperate for. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. Pulling on a dark coat, he stepped into the wet night. The city smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and exhaust fumes. He kept his hands in his pockets, feeling the reassuring weight of the small voice recorder he had taken with him. The corner of 7th and Elm was dimly lit, a lone street lamp flickering in protest against the rain. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in her mid-40s, wearing a hooded jacket and a wary expression. She scanned the street before stepping closer. "My name's Elena," she said. "I used to work for Victor. I know things you can use, things that will destroy him if you're willing to listen." John studied her face, trying to read her intentions. The lines around her eyes hinted at a life lived in constant caution. He nodded for her to continue. "Victor's not just after your job. He's tied to a larger scheme. Money laundering, shell companies, offshore accounts. Rachel isn't just caught in the middle. She's part of it. Willingly." The words hit John harder than the rain. He wanted to argue, to insist Rachel couldn't be involved in something like that. But deep down, the last few weeks have been full of small signs. Missed calls, guarded answers, late nights that didn't add up. Elena handed him a flash drive. "Everything's on here. Emails, transaction logs, internal memos. But be careful. If Victor suspects you have this, you won't just lose your career. You'll be in danger. Before John could respond, headlights swept across the street. A black SUV turned the corner, slowing as it approached. Elena's eyes widened. "They found me," she whispered. "Go." She pushed the flash drive into his hand and bolted down an alley. The SUV accelerated, tires hissing on the wet pavement, and John caught a glimpse of tinted windows and a shadowy figure in the passenger seat. He didn't wait to see more. He ran in the opposite direction, the cold rain stinging his face as he clutched the flash drive like it was a lifeline. By the time he reached his apartment, his clothes were soaked and his heart was still pounding. He locked the door, shut the blinds, and plugged the flash drive into his laptop. Folders upon folders appeared on the screen. Names, dates, wire transfers. It was all there, and it was worse than Elena had described. At the center of it all was Victor. But threaded through the evidence, John found Rachel's name, her email address on correspondences approving transactions, her signature on authorization forms. The more he scrolled, the tighter the knot in his stomach grew. A sound from outside made him freeze. It was faint, but distinct, the creak of a stair underweight. Someone was in the building. The hallway light under his door flickered once, and then went dark. John's laptop screen reflected in his eyes as he reached for his phone. He didn't know if he was going to call the police, Elena, or someone else entirely. But before he could decide, a single knock echoed through his apartment. Slow, measured, almost polite. He didn't move. The knock came again, this time followed by a voice. "John," the voice called softly. "We need to talk." It was Rachel. The night air was colder than it should have been for the season, or maybe it was just John's nerves creating a chill that seeped through his jacket. He stood in the alley behind the hotel, his breath visible under the dim yellow glow of a flickering lamp. The rain from earlier had left the pavement slick, reflecting distorted fragments of neon from a distant bar sign. His mind replayed the events of the day. Emily's trembling voice, the intercepted call, and the whispered words that had shattered his belief that they were still in control. He checked his watch. 10 minutes until the meeting. He'd chosen this place because it was isolated yet close enough to the city for a quick escape. His phone buzzed, the sound sharp against the quiet. It was a single message from an unknown number. "You're being followed." Every instinct screamed to turn around, but he kept walking slowly toward the rendezvous point, letting his peripheral vision catch movement where the shadows shifted unnaturally. Someone was there, staying just far enough back to remain indistinct. He quickened his pace, but kept his breathing steady. If they wanted him cornered, he wasn't going to make it easy. Emily arrived first, her hair damp from the mist in the air, her expression taut. She glanced over his shoulder immediately. "You weren't followed, were you?" she asked. John didn't answer. He just moved closer to her, pulling her toward the entrance of the old storage building. Inside, the smell of dust and machine oil wrapped around them. One single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if disturbed moments earlier. A man emerged from the far corner, his face partially obscured by the shadow. It was Daniel, the one who had been missing for weeks, presumed gone. He looked thinner, his eyes sharper, and there was a strange calmness about him. "You should have listened when I told you to leave this alone," he said. John stepped forward. "You knew about this from the start. You let us believe you were dead." Daniel's expression didn't change. "It was the only way to stay alive. You have no idea who's pulling the strings. You're both in over your heads." Emily's voice cracked with restrained anger. "Then tell us. We can't keep running blind." But Daniel didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black device, a drive, no bigger than a matchbox. "This has everything. Names, accounts, shipments. It will end them, but it will also put you on every kill list they have. Once this is in your possession, there's no going back." The hum of the dangling bulb seemed louder now, the silence around them tightening like a noose. John reached for the drive, but Daniel pulled back slightly. "Not here," Daniel said, glancing at the walls. "They hear more than you think. We move to the river now." Before John could respond, a sharp metallic click echoed from the doorway. Two figures stepped in, dressed in black, their movements precise. No words were exchanged, just the gleam of weapons catching the dim light. Emily's hand found John's instinctively. Daniel dropped the drive into John's palm with a whisper. "Run." The first shot shattered the light bulb, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of footsteps and splintering would fill the void. John tightened his grip on Emily's hand and pulled her toward the back exit, the pounding of his heartbeat almost drowning out the chaos behind them. They burst into the alley, the cold air hitting them like a wall. Daniel's voice yelled something behind them, followed by another gunshot. John didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some part of him already knew that Daniel wouldn't be walking out. The river wasn't far, but the streets felt longer now, each to a risk. The drive in John's pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, heavy with more than just data. Every step was a choice between survival and justice, and he could feel time running out. When they reached the water's edge, the moonlight cut silver across the rippling surface. Emily bent over, catching her breath, but John kept scanning the shadows. They weren't alone. From across the bank, a figure appeared, tall, still, almost like a silhouette cut from the night itself. John couldn't make out the face, but the voice carried clearly across the water. "You have something that belongs to me." The sound of approaching engines grew from behind them. Trapped between the river and whatever was coming, John realized there was only one path forward, and it wasn't one he'd considered before. Emily's voice trembled. "John, what do we do?" The figure on the other side of the river took a step forward. "Choose wisely. You won't get another chance." The engines roared closer. The air was thick with the metallic tang of danger. And somewhere deep in his chest, John knew that the choice he made next would decide not only their fate, but the fate of everything they'd been fighting for. John woke to the muted gray of dawn, the kind of light that blurred the edges of reality and dream. His mind replayed the events of the last 24 hours like jagged shards of glass, each memory sharp, each one capable of cutting him again if he lingered too long. The storm had passed in the night, but in his chest a tempest still churned. He could hear the faint hum of the city waking beyond the window, yet the room around him felt strangely still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. His phone sat on the table, dark and silent, until it vibrated with a message from an unknown number. The text was brief. "We need to finish what we started. Meet me where it began." John's pulse kicked into a sprint. He knew exactly where that was. The abandoned pier at the edge of the harbor, the place where all of this had first taken root. As he dressed, the memories returned in waves. Emma's tearful eyes, the last time he saw her before everything fell apart. The betrayal he could never fully name. The way the truth had been dangling in front of him, but never quite within reach. He slid his jacket on, tucked the envelope of evidence in the inside pocket, and stepped into the morning air that smelled faintly of salt and diesel. The pier was nearly empty when he arrived. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the rusted metal of the shipping containers. A single figure stood at the end of the dock, back turned to him, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. He recognized the stance immediately. Emma. She turned as he approached, her eyes flicking to the envelope in his jacket before meeting his gaze. "I thought you'd come," she said, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something he couldn't name. "I almost didn't," John replied. "But I need the truth now. All of it. No more half answers. No more games." Emma took a slow breath, her hair whipping across her face before she brushed it back. "You think this ends with me, but it doesn't. There's more, John. There's always been more. What happened to you? What happened to us was planned long before you realized something was wrong." He stepped closer. "Then tell me who. Tell me why." Her lips pressed into a thin line before she reached into her coat and pulled out a small black USB drive. She held it up between two fingers. "This is what they've been after. It's not just money. It's not just revenge. It's everything. Names, accounts, the real reason they destroyed your life. You can take it and disappear, or you can open it and risk being hunted until the day you die." John's heart pounded as he drove from her. The cold plastic felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of every lie and every betrayal was inside it. "Why give this to me now?" "Because," she said, her voice breaking just slightly, "I'm leaving. I can't run from them anymore, but maybe you can do what I couldn't." A sharp crack echoed from behind them, the sound of a footstep on wet wood. John spun, catching sight of a tall figure emerging from between the containers, a gun raised and eyes locked on him. His mind went blank for a split second before instincts kicked in. He shoved Emma to the side as the shot rang out, splintering the wood where she had been standing. The man advanced, expression unreadable. "You weren't supposed to make it this far," he said. His voice was familiar, chillingly so. Recognition hit John like ice water. It was Mark, his oldest friend, the one he had trusted more than anyone. "You?" John's voice cracked in disbelief. "You've been behind this?" Mark's gaze didn't waver. "Not behind it. Part of it. Bigger than you can imagine. And you still don't know who's pulling the strings." Before John could respond, Emma grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the narrow gap between two crates. They ran, the pier echoing with footsteps and shouted threats behind them. When they reached the street, she shoved him toward a waiting motorcycle. "Go," she said, her eyes fierce. "Don't stop until you're somewhere they can't find you. And don't trust anyone. Not even me." John hesitated for a heartbeat, wanting to ask 100 questions, but the sound of engines revving in the distance pushed him into action. He started the bike, the USB drive burning in his pocket, and sped away into the maze of streets. As the city blurred around him, his mind was a storm of unanswered questions. He didn't know if Emma had just saved his life or set him up for something worse. He didn't know what was on the drive, or if he truly wanted to find out. All he knew was that the deeper he went, the more he realized the truth wasn't a single answer. It was 1,000 tangled threads, each one leading to a place darker than the last. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was still watching, waiting for him to make his next move.